Okay, everyone, here's the third lecture for week 5, looking at thinking strategically. I'm going to give you some added examples working in parallel with the way that the authors present to you some of the strategic modeling techniques. And here what we're going to deal with is sequential move games. Here, quoting Siren Kierkegaard, right? It's true life must be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. So we have worked on looking at outcomes of games. There is a concept that you should have seen so far regarding how one obtains to what we'll call dominant strategies. And recall the iterative process, which creates some challenges. That whole notion of I know what you know and you know that I know what you know is true, and so on. Here we're looking at a game that's sequential, such as a market entry game. Look at very large airplane companies, Airbus and Boeing. At one point in time, they lacked a jumbo jet, and there was a monopoly, basically, in a particular segment, where 747, the Boeing product, had the dominant status, and Airbus executive recognized that. So Airbus decided to build a super jumbo jet. They did feasibility studies, and they realized that basically there would probably be room for one mega-seater aircraft. But Boeing realized that potential entry and decided it would build a plan. The plan was to build an aircraft much larger in that super jumbo jet category. So the game could be modeled as follows. Airbus is pondering that it would be a first mover. Boeing then is the second mover in the sequence. They each have a strategy to either go into the market or stay out of the market. Okay, and then so you can see us modeling Airbus going out, staying out, right? Then Boeing moving and deciding to go out or stay in. If they stay out and out, right, no one is in that market, so there's no money to be made. If Airbus stays out and Boeing goes in, there's a $1 billion loss from development, and Airbus further loses money, and it's because of the loss of market share, basically. And Boeing could react to Airbus going in, and if they both go in, they have a $4 billion loss. And if Boeing stays out where Airbus goes in, then you have Airbus with a little bit of gain and Boeing with a loss. So that's just a variety of numbers and moves that are in place. And what we've got to think about is Airbus making its first move. So it has to basically think about how Boeing might respond. See, we've got an if-then iteration here, right? If Airbus stays out, you go to that part of the game tree, look at Boeing's options, and you realize Boeing would stay out because Boeing doesn't want to lose $1 billion, right? Airbus, again, making the first move, thinks, okay, suppose we enter. So you go down the game tree, looking at Boeing's response to entry. And what we know is that Boeing is going to accommodate and stay out in such a process, too. Again, they just don't want to enter into this market. Now you go back to the situation where Airbus could go in or out, chop off the options that Boeing would never take. And what you know is it's an accommodation act on Boeing's part regardless. So the sequence, which is rational in sequence, right, is the in by Airbus, out for Boeing sequence. In isn't a credible action for Boeing. Okay. From the point of view of Airbus announcing this. But Boeing then announces it would build the plane and go in. 7 years have passed, and this would be the big, expensive aircraft, right? That whole duopoly game is a sequential game we've done an analysis for now. And what you note is that you had to think backwards. It's very easy using the game tree to do this. So you go back to the end of the game, and you trim the tree, moving backwards through the tree towards the beginning point of the game. Now, that's easy in a game tree, but challenging in practice. And Let's outline what we're going to think of as we go forward for some practical issues. What you do is you realize strategic moves happen in the early rounds, and we'll follow a rule of 3, and we'll practice seeing the end of the game. A rule of 3 is a reference back to the potential for complete analysis, we could call it. So if you go to Gore versus Bush again and recall the member preferences, we worked on looking at the majority rule results and the voting results that would occur under a different sequence or different patterning of votes put forward on our agenda. So notice that if we first had set up a Remand versus Gore, you can see either option playing out. Either we move along the game tree to a Remand result, and then we have to line up Bush versus Remand, and then of course either Bush or Remand wins that particular vote. Or on the bottom part of the game tree, imagine that Gore wins at the first stage. The second stage automatically has to be a Bush versus Gore lineup, and we either have Bush or Gore win. So you have to look forward and realize, how does the game end at that end point when Bush is up against the Remand? We know that the majority prefers to have the Remand result, so R would win in that case. The next part of the game to look at is the bottom part of the tree where Bush is lined up against Gore, and we see the majority would prefer Bush to Gore. So the game really is either going to result in a Remand decision or a Bush-favored decision. After we've sort of spliced off the branches of this tree that won't happen, we now have a modified game tree. We see that 3 judges prefer Gore to Remand to Bush. So if you look at them voting in the first round, thinking about what they think of in preference when you have Remand versus Gore, you can model exactly what part of the game tree we will wind up on. Now the Gore supporters have their preferences. If you look at the first round vote between the Remand and Gore, the Gore supporters are going to prefer Gore. But a vote for Gore turns into an effective vote for Bush. So it would be the case that the Gore voters should support Remand. This gives them the second best choice. So if you only think forward, it misses your chance for understanding the strategy of voting. And thinking forward would lead you to pick the wrong game. So sequential rationality in a game is crucial. You look forward and reason backwards. You have to anticipate your rivals. What are they going to do later? What are they going to do in the future in response to your actions that are taken today? What that also points out is it might not necessarily be a good idea to vote for your true preferences. This happens all the time if you look in politics. Amendments are often made to make the bad bills even worse. There's lots of crossing over behaviors in the open primaries, and centrist types of voting in primaries arises. All of these are the result of strategic voting. That is to say, voting which does not truly reflect people's preferences. However, there's still a predetermined outcome once you analyze the entire picture. So kind of thinking back to the Boeing Airbus thing, but now generalizing, we're looking at what happens if you attempt to do an accommodation kind of practice. A potential entrant could potentially be accommodated by an incumbent firm. So you always have to ask the question, should you enter? Or would a firm accommodate entry when you do go in? And what if there are, many, many potential entrants? A whole bunch of threats are coming about. Let's imagine there's a monopoly market in every state that you possess. Maybe you have one state or two, or maybe you have a whole bunch of states. But in essence, there's only one potential entrant in each state. And they make their decisions to enter each state in a sequence. Right? We're not sure which state will come, but for sure a state's going to enter in the sequence. Florida might enter today, and then New York might enter tomorrow, California the next day, and so on. And in each case, when an entrance occurs, you can accommodate that entry or you can fight it. So what you do in the first year, the game of staying out versus going in is the entrant part of the game. So the blue dots are the sequences of entrance into the market. The incumbent then has to decide to either accommodate and say, okay, the entry has come into place, or maybe we should fight. So this is an ongoing game. It's only really depicting here several moves out of hundreds of them. What you have to do is find the last period, the last entrant. Yeah, say let's go to the 50th state. And what you wind up identifying is that you don't have a reason to actually fight in that final moment. So what will happen is the rival has come into existence in that state, and the incumbent firm M has decided to accommodate. So then what you can do is say, well, in coupled with accommodate in that last part of the game indicates that you should remove the fight branch, and then you can work backwards through all of the previous moves, 49 moves of that game. So we note the incumbent would not fight the last entrant. The same reasoning, though, holds, that there's no reason to fight the previous entrant, and there's no reason to fight that previous entrant all the way back to the very first moment where we discover there's no reason to fight the first entrant. So there's only one sequential equilibrium in this game, where all the entrants are going to play the in option of their strategy, and the incumbent will play the accommodate option. Now, in long games, this is really theoretical. It only works if people really have done a good job of what we call backward induction. You have to be able to go forward into time to see the last periods. In practice, it turns out businesses tend to only look forward a few periods. This kind of works out by examining as a case study the prioritization of businesses, going after, let's say, regional markets. Here the regions might be zip codes with varying population densities. Let's say that these are, it could be like cell phone towers, or it could be some kind of small business center. I'll call it an SBC. Assume the break-even point is 300. So now we have positioned ourselves with 700 units in a particular region, 400 in another region, kind of dispersed, kind of far away. You see them looking like they're about 20 miles away, maybe, give or take. And that both of these arrangements exist and have operations beyond their break-even point is crucial. Perhaps you could enter the 400 SBC market. Now the next entrant, thinking of that, has to break even, so they have to expect to get some market share. 300 out of the 400 units have to be obtained. So they need 75% of that market. If you went after the 400 SBC market, the next entrant breaking even thinks, okay, I need 300 of the 700 units in terms of sort of this market intensity, and so I only need 43% market share. But the real decision here is actually all of 400 or really half of 700. And so this particular example translates into the typical branding and marketing problem of breakfast cereals. Let's say we produce our product at $1.2 million for development cost. We decide to sell at 0.3 on the sweetness scale. So we appeal to persons who prefer less sweet, the 1 on the scale, all the way up to kind of much more sweet than we're offering. And let's say we have sort of a normal curve of sales, where the bulk of our sales are clustered there around the 3 sweetness level. So at our peak, meeting that particular customer's sweetness preference, we've got around 600,000 units in sales at that point. And then less sales as we move further down the scale of preferences for sweetness, further up the scale. And notice that we don't really get any sales to persons who have sweetness levels of 6 or higher. In this case, we have profit equal to that triangle, let's say, right? Half of 600 times 5. And so we've got 1,500 minus 1,200 for, in our first product entry, 300 for our profit. So 300,000, we'll say. Say we decide to put into place our second product. The second product is looking like the first, but we've adjusted the sweetness far to the right on the scale, now our ideal position is sweetness level number 9. So we have another product that's been developed. We positioned it in the higher sweetness category, and it looks to be the same size triangle as before. So what we have is profit equal to the 2 triangles, so now 600,000. Imagine a third product entry comes into existence. Now this time we have significant crossover between each of the products. You see sweetness levels 4 and 5 are going to distribute themselves to purchases of the less sweet cereal and the moderate sweet cereal. And of course, persons within the preference scale 7, 8, they'll distribute themselves between the moderate and the more sweet. The profit here is 300 times 3 minus the overlaps, right? And this is a kind of a cannibalization scenario. So you got to remove the double counted parts of those triangles. Now you have 420,000 in profit. If a competitor enters into this, it becomes 300 times 2 minus 240. Now, if it's your own situation, the cannibalization isn't such a big deal. If it's the competitor who enters, our losses are amounting to the entirety of the sort of light pink area, right? Because we're not serving those customers at all. And then you can have basically 1/2 of each of the small sort of purple triangles. We could imagine about even distributions of 7 and 8 sweetness preferences between our competitor and our cereal. Likewise on the scale between the 4 and 5 preference numbers. As a summary, if you think forward, you're going to miss chances to make money. So you have to look to the logical end of any game, of any strategy. Also, from evidence, you should expect that others do not see the end point of the game until they're getting close to it. This is what we call the rule of 3. Persons tend to think ahead about 3 steps on average. So that's a complete, sort of an applied example, we'll call it. And I'm going to put this one up on Blackboard for the 3rd lecture, and I'm putting a new one up as well.